And even to then go and extract the money that the monopoly is making by franchise bidding, bidding for the right to be the monopolist, requires a bunch of competitors also know how much money the monopolist is making. And another problem, which we're going to talk a bunch about on Tuesday, and which will be on your next problem set, is that, if we charge a price that's equal to marginal cost, it's pretty hard to know whether it was even worth creating the market in the first place. Why is that? Well, at least if there's enough revenue to cover the average cost, or to afford some profit, we know that the consumers are willing to pay as much as the market is worth, right, at very least. However, if we charge at marginal cost, who the hell knows, right? Because at marginal cost, the firm will be making a loss. Who knows if it's even worth creating the product at all. So a classic example of this comes from a quote from Adam Smith, who figured this out 250 years before Sarah Palin did, which is that when the government uses general government revenue to build bridges, rather than charging the people who go along them for the cost of building the bridge, you end up, as he said, having many bridges built over places where no commercial traffic passes, right? If you don't require it to make a profit that compensates for the investment, right, you end up getting lots of bridges to nowhere. Another problem that can arise is capture and political corruption. So regulation can quickly become a way of corruption. Regulators can get cozy with those who they regulate, and therefore allow them to make a lot of profits or do all sorts of things, actually use the regulations to keep people from competing with them. And the consumers are usually too diffuse to really stop this. This is like what happens with licensure that we talked about. While organized consumer groups can help partially balance this, when things are very opaque, when things are very hard to understand, it's very hard for the consumers to know whether corruption is going on and therefore to stop it from occurring. And in some sense, this is really just an informational problem like the other problems we were talking about. It's just that the consumers don't have enough information to monitor the people who are supposed to be monitoring the company. If everything were really transparent, if the information were really easily available, it would be very easy for a little group of consumers to just run the numbers and figure out that everything was ripping them off. So the key problem in these regulatory issues is to make sure that there's someone in charge of making the decision who both has pretty good information and has incentives to act in the public interest. So to address some of these informational problems, it's much more common to use average cost rather than marginal cost regulation. And this is often called rate of return or cost plus regulation. And the idea is that the profits that the utility can make are capped at some low rate to justify the investment that was made. And this low rate of return is meant to cover natural returns on capital investment. So a simple model of this would just be to think of a price cap at average cost. We're going to talk about why that can be inefficient. Average cost pricing can be inefficient in a moment. But first, Vidor?
Yes.
What are some of the benefits that average cost pricing has over marginal cost pricing?
You can measure it a little bit better. You just take the overall cost and divide it instead of
Yeah, I think that's probably the primary benefit. So it doesn't require external subsidies. That's one good thing, right? But it's also just a lot easier to measure because you can just audit the firm and try to make them say what all their expenses were. And marginal cost, that's very hard. It's not like you just do an audit to determine a marginal cost. You actually have to figure out how would things change if we change the quantity. And we only need to know the average cost at a single point. So this makes David's problem much less severe, right? All we need to do is say to the company, look, if we catch you charging more than whatever your average cost is at whatever you produce, we're going to throw you in jail. But you don't actually need to know the whole cost curve, right? And if consumers are willing to buy at that price, then at least we know that it's worth creating the product. So average cost pricing can greatly lessen the informational problem that we have with regards to like whether the market should exist, you know, how we monitor the firm, etc. And this can be implemented either by rate of return regulation on private enterprises or by government ownership of the thing. And then once the government owns it, there's not going to be any profit paid, presumably. So the first is much more common in the OECD countries, especially the United States, where there's lots of private for-profit firms that are regulated by the government. So ComEd, I actually don't even know what that stands for. I know Ed stands for Edison. Commonwealth Edison is in charge of monitoring, is in charge of electricity in Chicago. They have a monopoly, and these are often owned by conglomerates of different utility operators. So ComEd actually runs the utilities for many different cities, not just Chicago, not just in Illinois. They're sort of, they own a bunch of these utilities. But then they're overseen by a local, state, or sometimes federal regulatory board. And these are usually made up of experts. And here in Chicago, it's the Illinois Commerce Commission. And sometimes these commissions hold an auction to own the initial right. So for example, telecommunications is basically a natural monopoly in certain areas because basically parts of the spectrum can only be efficiently occupied by one person. If other people try to get in there, it causes all sorts of interference. And so the FCC held an auction for the right to own spectrum in different parts of the country. And they use an extensive team of auditors to monitor prices and then commission research. In fact, the second long answer problem on the midterm was based on a book which was commissioned by the California regulator to study the optimal way to do second-degree price discrimination. So usually this type of regulation is not just purely economic in the way we were talking about, but also has other political goals. So David Guo? Yeah. David, what are some of the political goals that often come up that are less economically based? Yeah, so that's an important one. Another one is environmental protection, right? So like a lot of these state electricity boards are interested in reducing the environmental impact, not just in increasing economic efficiency. Also, sometimes there are politically powerful groups that have like lobbying power, and they can often get a special deal. Okay. Average cost regulation is used very widely. It's probably the most widely used form of regulation. And Calvin, what are some areas where average cost regulation is used?
Some of them are like the natural monopolies you talk about earlier, like power, like utilities in general.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So utilities are one of the most important examples. These are overseen by a state regulatory board, as I said. Public transport, quite a few bridges are actually required to eventually defray the costs of building them by charging high tolls for going on the road. Sometimes they get a subsidy, sometimes not. It's actually quite controversial. A lot of the public transit in the state has been moving to higher rates to try to make up for the subsidy that they get. Telecommunications in the United States used to be a regulated monopoly until the 1980s. And local calling, yeah, go ahead.
By average cost, you mean average total cost? Or
Average total cost, yeah. So local calling was for a long time subsidized down to really low prices, and then there were high prices charged on higher long distance calling, and that all averaged out to the average cost of AT&T, and there was a federal regulatory board that was in charge of making sure that worked out. But then the DOJ, the Department of Justice, brought a lawsuit to demonopolize that industry. They broke up AT&T into all these little baby bells that you've probably heard of. And then all those baby bells started merging with one another. And now both AT&T, the original company, and Verizon, which came out of Southern Bell and bought up a bunch of the other baby bells, are now like overwhelmingly dominant companies, and then the little competitors that still exist are basically being acquired by them, as you saw with the Verizon. So part of that is just anti-competitive, but part of it is that in some ways this industry really is a natural monopoly. And so if you try to break it up and turn it into something else, it sort of naturally starts consolidating again. So there's a debate over which of those things is true, but it's definitely complicated. Also in some countries, for example Peru, there is a legal way of achieving average cost pricing through the legal system, which is that you can bring a lawsuit if a firm is abusively pricing, so-called abusively pricing. That is, they're pricing to make a very large profit. And that can effectively force companies to do something like average cost pricing. But average cost pricing can arise not just from government regulation, but also by competition in the market. So if anyone can come into an industry, if we have free entry, then that will tend to drive prices down to cost, because anytime there's a positive profit that the firm is making, it's going to attract someone in to compete with it. Now, of course, as we said earlier, that only happens, things only get competed away if there's a large number of equally capable people who can run the industry, if they have easy access to capital and it doesn't require a lot of specialized knowledge to be in the industry, and if there are no barriers to entry. So in these cases, any profits that a firm makes will attract entrants. Yeah, Matt?
To what extent is there actually like these monopolized industries where there is free entry into these markets? Because I can't think of like a monopolized like utilities or telecommunications where there's actually free entry. Especially if there's like government subsidies going on.
Well, so I think we'll talk about a particular. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in a lot of these natural monopolies, that's not the case. But there's lots of other, we can use an analysis of average cost regulation applied to natural monopolies to think about other cases where there sort of would be a monopoly, but there's enough ability to enter that reduces the capacity of that firm to be a monopoly. So we can think of average cost pricing not just as something imposed by regulation, but something that could be the outcome of a natural market process. And we'll see some examples of that. So that leads to average cost pricing. And this can arise in an equilibrium without regulation. It's a very common assumption in economic models. I argued in lecture 5 that it might not actually be that realistic because of the heterogeneity in different people's abilities, but it's often a useful benchmark. Now, to get back to Matt's question, how when there is just a monopoly, could you still get something like average cost pricing? Well, there are some people who make a very bold claim, which is called the contestable markets argument, or contestability, which says that any time a firm is making a profit, it will tempt competitors to enter against it. And that a firm, even in the absence of someone competing with it, will just hold its prices very close to its average cost to avoid someone coming in to compete. And this seems a bit strange, because it requires a lot for a firm to be that afraid of someone entering against them, right? It requires that someone else can come in immediately and not just be competing with this firm, but grab the whole monopoly and earn all the profits and leave the other firm in the dust. And that seems pretty unlikely, because the other firm's probably going to try to compete with them if they enter in the industry, right? If they do, then it's not going to be the case that any profits they're making would attract in a competitor, because when the two firms are competing, then they're not going to be able to be at efficient scale, right? And they would lose money. So that's the first thing that it required. And that requires that the incumbent firm can't undercut the competitor when it comes into the market. And that there's no real fixed cost of entry or exit, because otherwise the other firm could get stuck in the industry and lose a bunch of money. So contestability, I think, is really quite implausible most of the time. However, it may be that even firms that aren't currently competing limit to some extent the prices that can be charged in the market, because people are afraid of potential